So, you okay? So good morning, everybody. Very glad, thank you very much, Kat, for inviting me. I'm very glad to be in Aarhus again, after a few years. I would like to give you a concrete idea of microphenomenology. This method was born from the idea advocated by the biologist Francisco Varela in the context of his neurophenomenological project, that to understand the functioning of the mind, science cannot rely only on the study of cerebral activity, but has to create a rigorous discipline to study human experience. At Varela's instigation, the entretien d'explicitation, an interview method initially developed by the French psychologist Pierre Vermersch for educational purposes and for analyzing professional practice, was adapted to research in cognitive science. The theoretical background of this interview technique is Husserlian psychophenomenology, Piaget's theory of becoming aware, and the theories of concrete memory of the French psychologists Ribot and Gusdorf. This interview method has then been complemented, on the one hand, by a method for analyzing verbal reports and detecting regularities in the form of generic structures. On the other hand, by methods for assessing the reliability of these results. And this adapted and complemented method became, 3 years ago, microphenomenology. This method is now used to study lived experience in various domains, such as the educational, clinical, and psychotherapeutic, technological, sportive, artistic, and contemplative domains. But why would we need specific methods to become aware of our lived experience? My lived experience, being the most personal and intimate thing to me, I think I'm familiar with it. And I cannot imagine for a moment that any particular effort should be necessary to become aware of it. However, microphenomenology starts from the observation that a large part of our experience remains unnoticed, unrecognized, pre-reflective in the phenomenological language. The main reason for this lack of awareness is that our attention is almost completely absorbed into the content, the what of our activity, to the detriment of this activity itself, the how. For example, while writing a paper, I'm completely absorbed in the content of the ideas I'm trying to express, but I'm hardly aware of the contact of my fingers on the pen or the computer keys, of the tensions in my back, of the rapid succession of inner images, slight emotions, and felt meanings, rapid evaluations that accompany or, in fact, constitute my activity of writing. Whatever our activity, writing, talking, listening, understanding, deciding, a large part of our experience, although lived through subjectively, is not immediately accessible to awareness and verbal description. However, this difficulty of access doesn't mean that our experience is out of reach. It means that accessing it requires a particular expertise, which must be learned. This expertise consists in carrying out specific acts. The macrophenomenological interview method aims at triggering, eliciting these acts through specific prompts and questions in order to help the interviewed person become aware of the unrecognized part of experience and describe it very precisely. So, the first principle of this method is that to become aware of this unrecognized part, the indispensable prerequisite is to choose a singular experience, precisely situated in space and time. Only the exploration of a singular experience makes it possible to leave our preconceptions, explanations, and generalization about the experience in order to become aware of what we actually live. In other words, to realize a phenomenological epoche. For example, if I asked you, how do you go about writing a paper? It's almost sure that in a first stage, I would obtain rather scanty descriptions. You would probably be tempted to describe what you know about this activity, how you represent it. But it's only by exploring a specific experience of writing that you could become aware of how you really go about writing. The choice of a singular experience to investigate is therefore an essential stage of the interview. If the type of activity which is explored is easily reproducible, for example, solving a little problem or a sensory experience, the researcher can design what we call an experiential protocol, enabling the interviewee to carry out the process here and now, and then just afterwards help him or her describe this experience. This is a provoked experience. If the experience being studied cannot be reproduced at will, for example, the emergence of an intuition or the prodroma of an epileptic seizure, the researcher helps the interviewee to retrieve in the past a particular occurrence of this experience. This is an invoked experience. But even if the interviewee has chosen a singular experience to explore, very often she shifts quickly from the description of her actual experience toward the verbalization of comments, beliefs, judgments, explanations, and theoretical conceptions about the experience. We call these statements the satellite dimensions of experience. The role of the interviewer is to identify in which dimension the interviewed person is at any given moment and to help her refocus on the experience itself. For instance, one of the devices consists whenever the interviewee uses an abstract term likely to convey an implicit preconception, in repeating it in the interrogative form and inviting her to describe the concrete action that underlies this term. For example, if the interviewee says, "I experienced a resistance," the interviewer replies, "Take your time to go back to the moment when you experienced a resistance. At that moment, how do you resist? Or how do you know that you are resisting?" The second key to the microphenomenological interview is to help the subject evoke the past or just past experience. Evocation is a form of memory that we all know very well, which consists in recalling a past situation with its sensorial and emotional component to the point that it becomes more present than the present situation is. Evocation falls within a type of memory that Husserl called passive memory. We are indeed always in the process of memorizing what we live, but involuntarily, without being aware of memorizing. For example, right now, you are not memorizing voluntarily the color or the texture of the walls, the number of windows in the room, the number of participants, the color of the tables, or the sound of my voice. But tonight, tomorrow, next month, maybe, you could be able to remember them. As this process of passive memory unfolds without our knowing it, we do not know what we know. This explains that at the beginning of an interview, people usually begin by saying, "I don't know what I did. I don't remember anything. However, the information that have been memorized passively can be awakened. For example, may I ask you the following question? What was the first thought you had when you woke up this morning? Give a sign to me when you have retrieved this thought. What was your first thought this morning when you awoke? Okay, thank you. I hypothesize that for recovering this thought, this first thought, you had no other way than going back to your bed at the moment when you awoke. Right? You had to retrieve the contact of the sheets, the light through the curtains, the sound of the alarm clock, or the odor of the coffee. A memory that has been memorized passively cannot be deliberately set off through an effort, but it is possible to foster its emergence by rediscovering the sensations associated with the experience. You will probably recognize there a very well-known example of such a sensorial trigger. This is why, in the context of a microphenomenological interview, after helping the interviewed person to identify a specific situation, the interviewer helps her to rediscover precisely the sensorial context of the situation, until the past situation is reenacted or presentified, to the point that it becomes more present than the interview situation for her. A set of objective, verbal, paraverbal, and non-verbal clues allow the interviewer to assess the intensity of the evocation. The verbal clues are, for instance, the use of the word I instead of we, for example, the use of the present tense. An example of non-verbal indicator is the defocusing of the gaze, the fact that the interviewee stops eye contact with the interviewer to look off into space. At the same time, the flow of speech slows down considerably. Words are often cut with silences and are accompanied and sometimes even replaced by gestures. The third principle of the interview is to help the subject inside the evoked experience to loosen the focus of her attention on the what in order to let the how emerge. In other words, to realize a phenomenological conversion. The unfolding of the how has two distinct dimensions, a diachronic and a synchronic dimension. The diachronic dimension corresponds to the unfolding of experience in time. It is the succession of actions, perceptions, thoughts, emotions we live in a given situation. The synchronic dimension corresponds to the characteristics of experience at a given instant, which cannot be described under the form of a succession. For example, the mode of attention or the sensorial modalities which are mobilized at a given instant. It is as if we could stop the video of the experience to make a freeze frame. Microphenomenological questions have two main characteristics. First, the questions do not concern the content of the experience, but its structure. Structure-driven or content-empty or content-free, three ways to say the same thing, questions draw the interviewee's attention towards the structural characteristics of the experience without inducing any content. For example, we know, at least we hypothesize, that whatever its content, an experience unfolds in time, as a succession of moments. Time is a structural characteristic of experience. Therefore, to collect the diachronic description of the experience, the interviewer asks questions that guide the interviewee's attention towards the various moments of the experience, without suggesting any content. For example, how did you start? What happened then? What did you end with? This mode of questioning enables the researcher to obtain a very fine-grained diachronic description without infiltrating any presuppositions. Here is a short excerpt of interview. I read this quickly. Would you agree to come back to the moment where I asked you, I would like you to spell the word elephant? What happened then? At that moment, the thought I had in my head vanished. How did it vanish? Was it instantaneous or gradual? It was very quick, but it nevertheless took a moment. And what happened during this moment? I loosen my tension on that thought. And when you loosen your tension on that thought, what do you loosen? In fact, I loosen a light tension in my head. Where exactly is this light tension in your head? It's at the top to the right and at the front of the head. And when you loosen it, how do you go about it? What do you do? As you can notice, the questions of the interviewer are limited to drawing the subject's attention to the various moments of the experience. For example, what happened then? What happened during this moment? The researcher's questions also rely on all the clues of implicit information she can detect, and they aim at making this information explicit. For example, a key question consists in questioning the verbs of action used by the interviewee. When she says, I loosen a tension, the interviewer asks, when you loosen this tension, what do you do? This question is at the same time very precise, very focused, and non-inductive, because completely empty of content. It helps the interviewee stabilize her attention on the subtle inner act, become aware of how she carries out these acts, and provide a more precise description. In the same way, the question, how do you know that your attention is now focused? Loosened, draws the interviewee's attention towards very implicit criteria of accurate realization of this micro act of loosening. The clues of implicit information may also be non-verbal, like the gestures that often accompany or replace words in a non-conscious way. For example, in the interviewee says, at that moment, I become worried. The researcher can draw her attention towards a possible bodily sensation, unnoticed bodily sensation, through a question such as, what is happening there? Or, how is this like? As you can see, the skill of the interviewer consists in asking very simple economic questions. Amazingly, it seems that the more simple questions are the more powerful to help the interviewed person become aware of her experience and describe it. As you can see, microphenomenological interviews have an iterative structure, which helps the subject repeatedly evoke the experience to be described, while guiding her attention towards a progressively finer diachronic and synchronic mesh. The description of just a few seconds of experience usually requires about 1 hour of interview. This process results in very fine-grained descriptions, notably of the usually unrecognized microdynamics of experience, of experiences that seemed initially instantaneous, devoid of diachrony. I will give an example of the unfolding of the awareness of such an experience in 2 minutes. Now, I would like to present briefly microphenomenological analysis. The main principle of the microphenomenological interview is to focus on a singular experience. However, this focus doesn't mean that the method is limited to only describing individual tokens of experience. Beyond the infinitely varying contents of singular experiences, the method makes it possible to identify generic characteristics which constitute the structure of the experience of the understudy. The analysis method consists on the basis of the collected descriptions in identifying and representing the specific structure of each singular experience, while progressively unfolding the generic structure of the type of experience being investigated. It is an iterative process that we can schematize this way. The specific analysis is divided into 2 stages. Kat?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. So the specific analysis, the analysis of a singular experience, is divided into 2 stages: the diachronic analysis and the synchronic analysis. The diachronic analysis consists in identifying the temporal structure of the experience under the succession of phases, subphases, sub-subphases, and so until the level of very subtle micro-acts. This operation of fragmentation is greatly facilitated by the iterative structure of the interview itself and by the interviewer's frequent recapitulations, which allow her to verify her understanding of the chronology of the experience. This operation of fragmentation also relies on the identification of the hinge points or events which trigger the transition between the different phases of the experience. Now, the synchronic structure and the synchronic analysis consists in identifying the structural characteristics of the experience at given moments in time. A synchronic structure is represented under the form of a semantic network of descriptive categories. Here is an example of synchronic structure, where the arrows represent the operations that enable the analyst to abstract, literally to pull out from minimal statements at the bottom that we call descriptem, minimal descriptive units, more and more generic categories. These 3 abstraction operations, classification, generalization, and aggregation, have long been known by logicians. In fact, we use them constantly in everyday life, but usually implicitly, without knowing that we use them. To give an example of microphenomenological analysis, I would like to describe briefly the results of a study of the emergence of an intuition, defined as a knowledge that comes about without the intermediary of a deductive mechanism. For example, a new scientific idea, the solution of a personal problem, a therapeutic insight, or an artistic intuition. I confess that I started this study. It was my PhD under the supervision of Francisco Varela. I started it with a moment of perplexity. What could I find to describe a knowledge deemed immediate, emerging suddenly and in an unpredictable way, except its content? However, thanks to microphenomenological interviews, I began to collect descriptions of the sensory form of the intuition at the moment of its appearance. An intuition can emerge as an image, as sounds or words, or as a feeling. Thank you. It may also arise in several simultaneous or successive forms, or as a thought without words. So the structure of the intuitive experience first emerged in the form of different possible values of a single descriptive category, its sensory form. Encouraged by this first result, I began to identify in the subsequent description clues of a before the intuition. The first phase of this diachronic unfolding took the form of an attentional disposition favorable to the unpredictable emergence of the intuition. It's a mode of intuition, of attention, whose center has shifted from the head, the eyes, the ears, to the body. It is a panoramic, holistic, diffuse mode of attention, which is, however, very fine, sensible to the most subtle discontinuities. And it's a receptive, unintentional mode of attention. 4 descriptive categories of this mode of attention thus emerged by fragmentation of the initial category: the source, the span, the degree of resolution, and the direction of attention. The identification of this propitious mode made it possible to unfold further the diachronic structure of the intuitive experience upstream through the detection of a gesture of letting go or giving up that enable one to achieve this inner disposition. This gesture of releasing the tension on the goal to be reached is induced by various voluntary or involuntary processes that I don't have time to describe. And progressively, it became clear that once the propitious state, attentional state, is reached, an intuition rarely emerges all of a sudden and complete as a sudden illumination. But most often, it emerges in a progressive manner, in the form of a slow ripening, which originates in a blurred and fuzzy feeling. In short, loosening the usual absorption into the content of the intuition made it possible to highlight a generic dynamic structure of the intuitive experience. This brings me to the question of assessing the reliability of microphenomenological results. First, we can notice that the emergence of a generic structure from a corpus of descriptions provided by different subjects, especially when the experience under study has been little explored and there are no pre-established categories to describe it, is a strong intersubjective clue of reliability of these descriptions. The singular and non-reproducible character of the content of a given experience does not prevent the intersubjective validation of experiential structures. The very existence of these structures has an important epistemological consequence. Indeed, once detected by a research team, a structure constitutes a hypothesis, likely to be validated or invalidated by the work of other teams. Experiential structures are thus results which are reproducible and therefore verifiable and falsifiable, which is the kingpin of any scientific validation. However, for a result to be reproducible, something is missing. There is another important requirement. This result must be accompanied by a description of its process of production. This brings me to my last point, the performative assessment of the reliability of microphenomenological results. After almost each presentation, when I present microphenomenology, I am asked the following question. How can you be sure that a description corresponds exactly to the initial experience? The answer is, we cannot be sure. Since the initial experience is definitely past, it is impossible to evaluate directly the correspondence of the content of a description with the content of a past experience. All we can do is to evaluate the present process that generates a description through clues of reliability or unreliability of the interviewees and interviewers' acts. Microphenomenology advocates a performative view of the reliability of a description, as opposed to a correspondentist view. On the side of the interviewee, these processual clues enabling the analyst to evaluate the process that generated the description are notably the clues of evocation, the consistency of the description, in spite of the iterative structure of the interview, is a strong complementary criterion of authenticity. The difficulty, if not the impossibility, of inventing a coherent narrative without the guiding thread of a lived experience has been demonstrated, notably by studies on confabulation in the juridical context. The subject's ability to provide a very precise description is an additional clue that this description does not come from an implicit theory, because no theory describes inner processes as such a level of detail. On the other side, the clues of accuracy of the perlocutory acts of the interviewer are, for example, the structure-driven character of the questions and the relevance of the evocation inductions. All this means that the particular experience, consisting in becoming aware of one's experience and describing it, also has a structure. It's not a random event, but a definite process made of precise micro-acts, which can be learned, refined, and reproduced. It is this generic dynamic structure of the process of becoming aware that makes it possible to develop a disciplined study, maybe a science of lived experience. This is why we consider the description of this process, initiated in the book On Becoming Aware by Varela, Deprat and Vermersch, so essential. It is the main current research avenue of microphenomenology. A refined knowledge of the acts that enable us to become aware of our experience and describe it, and of the acts that elicit this process in the context of an interview, are essential. An interview or other circumstances, possibly other circumstances. But this knowledge is essential to refine and improve these acts, to trigger, guide and teach them more efficiently, to evaluate the various degrees of mastery of these acts through precise criteria, to compare what different methods do in order to trigger, guide and teach these acts. This makes it possible to evaluate to what extent these methods are compatible and complementary, and which one is more adapted to the description of which type or dimension of experience. Refining our knowledge of these acts also allows the progressive creation of a more and more refined and shared vocabulary for experiential research, an essential condition for constituting a community in this domain. Thank you very much for your attention.